I can take my lunch whenever I want.
Yeah, I'll try not to do anything too embarrassing for the visitors. Anything possible.
Seems it's got some adjustment kind of thing?
Yeah, if they're adjustment or
Yeah.
I might just have to order another one and,
What'd you get?
it's a yes.
Oh, cool. Yeah,
So,
good for you.
yeah.
Did you meet it yet? Because she asked that.
Because I thought it was pretty cool. Sorry, I guess I turned around. Nice to meet you. I just came. Awesome, yeah, I saw. Okay, good.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. I'll try to keep my my distance here just so I can be more audible. Before we start, I don't think this has gone out yet, right, Hillary, or maybe a little bit? Just did, okay. Just some news. Because of our recent surge this week, we're adjusting our ticketing for this weekend's concert. Namely, we've actually sort of cut off ticket sales as we speak, so I hope you already have yours. And we'll be doing a general admission with spacing for the audience rather than our usual pre-assigned seats. If you have any questions about that, contact the office. An email just went out that outlines more details about that. So we're monitoring the situation, of course, and trying to do the best things here. But yes, the concert is happening. No, you might not get the seat you all thought you were going to get. But that's essentially the news for the moment. The theme for this concert is that we are celebrating youth, so to speak. We have 4 pieces by composers who were all very, very good teenage composers. And 3 of those pieces were actually written by these composers when they were teenagers. The one exception is our ending piece, which is by Georges Bizet, most famous for Carmen, the opera. And we're playing a piece that he wrote closer to the end of his short life. But I couldn't resist. It's called Games of Children, Jeux d'enfants. And so it sort of fit the theme really perfectly. 5 cute little character pieces, each named after a different kind of toy. So there's a trumpet and drum movement, there's a doll movement, which is kind of a lullaby. There's a top where the violists sit there and go for about 4 minutes in a row. Every now and then the top falls down and the cellos sort of have this sort of depressing little thing as the top does its thing. But that'll be our cute ender. As I say, Bizet did write lots of great music when he was quite young, but again, this is one of his later pieces. Also on the program is an overture by Schubert. Schubert, Viennese composer from the early 1800s, also a very accomplished teenage composer, most famous probably now for his art songs, music for voice and piano, but also a very active symphonic composer, chamber music composer. And he actually wrote a lot for stage, opera and ballet. And so our opener is one of his overtures to a little sort of German kind of popular entertainment operetta that he wrote called The Four-Year Post, which is about somebody who was supposed to, sort of a soldier who's supposed to be manning this sort of outpost in the middle of nowhere. And nobody's paying attention for about 4 years, and so it sort of runs off, and then people come back and he has to pretend that he's been there the whole time. So that one sort of evokes the kind of rural setting, which mostly means that there's a really prominent oboe part, which is what you do when you want to evoke a rural setting. No conversation about really good, really young composers is complete without Mozart, right? The greatest prodigy the world has ever known, right? And the piece we're going to play by him was one that he wrote when he was 17. And it comes from a very sort of interesting part of his life, which I'll get to in just a second. If you were at our last preview, we played some Bach. And I talked a little bit about Bach and how we know almost nothing about his day-to-day life. And the reason for that is that he had the kind of life where he didn't have to write a lot of letters. He didn't have to leave behind a lot of documents, especially during the end of his life, the last few decades, where he was in Leipzig, he was sort of in the same place, in basically the same job. So he wasn't having to send stuff all over the world to make things happen. And as a result, most of Bach's days don't leave any kind of written record, except for the music that he wrote, really. And so we have to sort of piece together things based on clues to figure out where he was a lot of the time. That is not true of Mozart. We have absurdly detailed notes about where Mozart was for a huge part of his life. And like TMI kind of stuff, that, like really unfiltered letters and things like that. Yeah, you learn, if you ever read all of Mozart letters, you'll learn things about him that you never needed to know. But I'll leave that for now. And part of this was because he was on the road all the time with his family. He and his father were always trying to get gigs to happen and stuff like that, so there was all this correspondence happening between cities. And so, as I said, we know a lot about his day-to-day activities. So, Mozart was born in Salzburg. His father, Leopold, is maybe the kind of perfect combination if you are looking to raise child prodigies. He is a very prominent teacher. He writes one of the first sort of well-known violin method books. He is a composer. He has a very strong entrepreneurial spirit. He's a court musician, but he's not like the head court musician, so it's easier for him to do things like get time off than if he were the actual sort of music director in Salzburg. But he just was really sort of an ambitious guy in the kind of entrepreneurial sense. And so when he realizes that two of his children are exceptionally gifted musicians, I'll back up a second. I say two of his children. They had 7, 5 of whom almost immediately died. And that's a downer, I know, but I want to mention that because it's one of these sort of things that hits me every now and then, that we're so used to this expectation that when a child is born, it's probably going to live, that I think we forget how recent that is in some ways. So the Mozart family, they had 7 children, 5 of whom died in infancy. That was maybe a little bit worse than average. I mean, if you had 7 kids, you'd probably expect maybe 3 to make it. So they were a little bit unlucky, but not that unlucky for the time. So, as I said, 2 of them, again, show incredible musical gifts right away. The older one, Non-Aero, as she's known, Mariana, is a pianist, and when they describe her playing, usually what they say is she's incredibly mature. So she's playing really difficult music, and she's playing with like sort of great style and things like that. When Wolfgang, the younger one, who's 5 years younger, when they talk about him, they talk a lot more about his sort of showmanship. So he'd get up to the piano and play incredible things, but he also really liked to improvise, and he really liked to sort of play around with his audience. And of course, he liked to compose, which is something that Non-Aero didn't really seem to show much interest in doing. They basically had one composition by her. But anyway, so Leopold, again, sees that his 2 children are incredibly gifted, and so he decides he's going to take them on tours. And Leopold, so the first thing he does is says, my landlord knows is a really rich guy, and he knows this kind of aristocratic family over sort of in Linz, which is sort of on the way to Vienna. And he says, I'm going to write to my landlord, and the landlord's going to write to this guy in Linz and see if we can get a performance for the court there. And this is part of this thing where essentially like, it's a lot like being a street musician, where you want to sort of put yourself in a good place, and you hope that the rich people who are listening will give you money. Technically, the way it works is the pleasure of performing for such a prominent individual is all the recompensation that I need, right? Realistically, you want them to give you stuff. And so it just sort of depends on the mercy of the rich person that you're playing for. So anyway, Leopold sets up his first gig, and they go to Linz, and the kids just blow everybody away. It's amazing. And it does exactly what Leopold wants it to do. The people in Linz know the Empress in Vienna. This is the Habsburg Empress. And so they continue on to Vienna, and again, this is Mozart at this time. Wolfgang is all of age 5 or 6, something like that. And he is now like good friends with one of the most powerful human beings in Europe. And they are very richly rewarded. They get money that is more than Leopold's annual salary. They also get outfits from the court, sort of formal wear for the 2 kids. And that doesn't seem quite as impressive, but one of the sort of difficulties about comparing things from different eras is that different things have different kind of relative costs. So if you were living in Vienna in Mozart's day, if you wanted to get a place to rent, that was cheap, that was easy, that was nothing. If you wanted a new outfit, that was like all but impossible, that was hugely expensive. So the idea that you give these two kids really nice sort of formal wear that they were going to grow out of in about 2 months, that's like an incredibly sort of generous to the point of sort of silly kind of gift that you could give someone. And so anyway, they get their paintings painted. It's one of the earliest sort of portraits we have of the children is in these sort of finery. Anyway, obviously this is going great. Leopold's making a ton of money. The court in Salzburg, where Leopold supposedly works, they're more or less on board with him taking all this leave because it puts Salzburg on the map. Salzburg's a pretty small town. And so he decides, you know what, we're going all in. We're going to do a huge tour of Europe, which means that they go sort of through German-speaking lands, they go over to Paris, they go up through London, they come back down through the Low Countries, through The Hague and things like that. Before making it back to Salzburg again, they go sort of through Switzerland on their way back. And it probably would have gone on longer, except again, there's this whole issue with kids and how they tend to die. And the kids kept getting sick, and Mozart in particular, the younger one, Wolfgang, got very ill several times during the course of these trips. On a later one, when they're going through back to Vienna and up to Olomouc in the Czech Republic, Moravia, they get scarlet fever, or smallpox. There's a smallpox epidemic. Mozart essentially almost dies on that trip. He's blind for 9 days. And that could have been the end of the story right there. The fact that Mozart dies when he's 35 is not at all kind of unexpected eventuality, given his health and given the fact that doctors at the time had no idea what they were doing. They essentially, if you were trying to kill somebody, being a doctor was a pretty good way to do it at the time. But anyway, so that's great. Mozart Wolfgang at this point is sort of European famous throughout the entire continent. Again, this little kid who is, again, so easygoing and good-natured and brilliant at the keyboard and willing to do all these cool parlor tricks where you blindfold him and he plays, and sight reading all this incredibly difficult music and impressing people with his perfect pitch and things like that. So everybody knows who this kid is. That's great, but if I may quote Marge Simpson's sister-in-law, the older they get, the cuter they paint. And he's in this really difficult situation after they make this tour, right? So as I said, they go back to Vienna, and they go and they want to meet the Empress again and things like that. But this is old news a little bit at this point, and it's as impressive as it is when you're 5, when you're 9, it's just sort of not the same deal, even though theoretically that's still really amazing. They also have some bad luck on that trip. Again, the smallpox thing happens. They're there expecting there to be a wedding, a big sort of royal wedding, Lil and Kate kind of thing. So people are going to want parties, which means they're going to want music. The bride dies the day before the wedding, so suddenly it's a sort of mourning situation rather than a celebratory situation. And so all of these trips, as they go, they sort of get harder and harder. After that, so Mozart is in his sort of awkward teenage years. And again, they're having to make this sort of transition from wunderkind to actual working musician. And so now Mozart is going to be sort of judged. Even if people are still really impressed by his youth, he's going to be looking for jobs that adults are doing. So he's going to want to get opera commissions, things like that. And he is, and he can, and he does get those, and they're great. But again, there's more competition there, so things don't come nearly as easy. He and his father, they sort of take a few trips to Italy to see if they can get something going. And again, gets a few gigs that way, writes a few operas for the Italian scene there, but it doesn't really turn to a position. There's no sort of momentum building in that way. It's also around this time that Leopold Mozart and Wolfgang Mozart's boss in Salzburg start to say, you know, you've been on the road a lot. It'd be really nice if you actually did your job for a while. And so basically they call him back to Salzburg, and they spend several years being mostly based there. And like I was alluding to with Bach, right? For most of Mozart's life, we have tons of documentation about what he was doing for any given day. But there's this huge sort of blank spot in his late teenage years because he was just in Salzburg the whole time. And his family was in Salzburg the whole time. And they weren't writing letters back to each other, they would just talk to each other over dinner, right? So we know they were there, we have the music, but we don't have the sort of day-to-day kind of description of his life that we do for much of the time. One of the reasons this is amazing has to do with this piece, 25th Symphony. So what was Mozart doing during this time? So Mozart, again, Wolfgang I'm talking about, was also employed at the court. He was the concert master. Had to play violin, which he didn't really like doing. And he was writing music sort of to order for any sort of occasion that the court needed. So a lot of that was party music, tons of things that were called serenades. I also mentioned serenade is my favorite word in the world for a musical piece because it basically means nothing. It's music that you listen to at night, which, depending on what you're doing on any given night, could mean anything in the world. He's writing pieces that are called divertimentos and cassations. He's writing music for end-of-the-year celebrations at the university. The head honcho in Salzburg is an archbishop, so he's having to write lots of church music, he writes church sonatas, things like that. And he's writing symphonies as well. And these would be a lot like, again, these are sort of party, these are celebratory pieces for some kind of occasion where people are getting together. But we don't generally know which went with which, right? It's just, here's what we know he was doing, here's a bunch of music that happened around that time, and then we just have to guess, sort of, if we want to assign any of these to a certain time. What's interesting about Symphony number 25 is that most of the music Mozart's writing during this time is really charming and pleasant and nice and sweet. And this is not. This is weirdly intense and like heavy and angsty. And the way I like to think of it is like if you went to a party expecting to hear like smooth jazz, and then suddenly they put on like Slayer or something like that instead. I mean, it's sort of like that. Like you wouldn't expect to hear this kind of music at most of the events that Mozart was writing for. And so basically it's this really kind of sort of regret of mine that I have no idea why he wrote this piece. Because it was either some kind of really interesting event or it was some very important like, piece of self-expression. But we don't know what it was. So what is different about this piece? Why is this so different than the ones around it? Well, first of all, if you speak German, you see that G-Moll, you know that means G minor. Mozart wrote exactly 2 minor key symphonies out of the 40-some-ish that he wrote. And this is one of them. This is the first one. There's a later G minor symphony, a very famous one, number 40 as well. But minor music by itself is extremely rare during this time. 98% of the music written in the second half of the 18th century is in major. So anytime you see something in minor, that's weird by itself right off the bat. And even besides that, it just has this incredible kind of intensity, this, as I say, sort of angst, this sort of fire to it, which is so different from a lot of the music that Mozart's writing around this time. This was, if you saw Amadeus, this opening section you might recognize because it's very prominently featured in that film. Before we do more, let's take a quick listen to this opening. again. And one of the reasons I chose this particular video is that they're doing something a little strange here, where virtually everybody here is playing a modern instrument, but the horns are playing valveless horns. Obviously, we'll talk a little bit more about horn stuff later on, but it's a really interesting thing about this. One of the things that is unusual about this piece, among a million things, is that it has 4 horn parts, and at a time when 2 was probably the standard. One of the reasons for that is that minor keys tend to be sort of awkward for valveless horn. The notes that you can get on the horn without valves, the ones that sound the best, most open, correspond a lot more to major scale-ish kind of things than minor scale-ish kinds of things. So in order to get around that, you've got 2 pairs of horns and 2 different keys, and they're basically trying to sort of work around each other to fill up the melodies as best as they can. The other thing you'll hear in this, I'll try to point that out, is that even when you do that, even if you try to get as many open-ish notes as you can, not all of them are. You have to do crazy stuff with your right hand and the bell to get some of these notes to happen. And some of them, and when they do that, you can really hear the difference. There's one sort of place in particular where it sounds like a really great horn note, really nasty, startly horn note, right back to back with each other. And you can really hear, again, on valve instruments, those notes are going to sound not the same exactly, but they're both going to be open notes. But on a valveless instrument, one of those is going to be open, one of those is going to be stopped-ish, and so they sound quite different from each other. So when that happens, I'll try to point that out. Starting over. Notice the lack of valves, right? So it's coming right up. Right here. Open. Hear those 2 notes sound different? Yeah. So we're going to continue on to the second half of the piece. One other thing I'm going to point out here that's a little bit very much of the time of this piece. Prior to Mozart, again, like Bach era, sort of the earlier part of the 18th century, the instruments you used for the bass line weren't always particularly well defined. They had this thing called basso continuo, and sometimes they would write out, we really want the bassoon to play this, or we really want the cello to play this, or we really want the theorbo to play this, which is basically a lute that looks like it was made by Warner Brothers. But they didn't always say. It's basically whatever sort of unit of low instruments you have at your disposal, that's what you would cover the bass line with. You'll see bassoonists playing in this movement, they don't actually have a part. So this is sort of a kind of vestige of this particular kind of writing that was sort of going out of style, sort of near the end of Mozart's life. By the end of Mozart's life, you're basically telling what instrument, what to play. But here, in this piece, there's just a bass line. We're assuming that cellos and basses are going to play it. And we also know that we have independent bassoon parts in the next movement that are written out. So people just more or less assume that the bassoon would have played along with this first movement. But Mozart doesn't actually tell us to do that. That's something that we just sort of figure might have happened because, again, they didn't always specify what bass instruments they wanted to use. Let's listen to a little bit more of this one. It's fun. Good. I can't resist pointing this out, even though I don't think we'll actually get a chance to listen to it. Again, this is a weirdly ambitious piece for the sort of functions that Mozart was writing. And one of the things that makes it ambitious is that it has what we would call cyclic elements, meaning that stuff that happens in the first movement comes back in the last movement and vice versa. That was, I won't say unheard of. Haydn wrote 106 symphonies, so basically Haydn was the first to do everything. But it's something that's really rare at this time. It wouldn't become a popular thing until the Romantics got hold of the idea. But it happens in this piece. This little tune that you're hearing right now is going to become the nugget that makes the main tune in the last movement. Again, we won't listen to that, but again, it's a weirdly kind of composer with a capital C kind of choice to make. And one that you wouldn't make if you were just tossing something off for some party where people would be background noise. Coming back to the beginning here. we have some time for some Strauss, but there's more to that. As I say, virtually everything on this concert written by teenagers, and the Strauss Horn Concerto No. 1, no exception. Richard Strauss was about 18 when he wrote it. Strauss actually lived for a long time, lived to be 85, long enough to have a kind of awkward and ultimately exonerated relationship with the Nazi Party. Grew up in Munich, and basically a child Strauss you'd sort of describe as one of those kinds of brats that's always hanging out at his dad's job kind of thing. So Richard Strauss's father, Franz, was a horn player, was a composer, actually wrote a horn concerto of his own that it seems like every undergraduate horn major in the country plays at some point. And so Strauss was always at rehearsals, he was taking conducting lessons, he was writing music from the age of 5 or so, and just sort of always around all these really prominent musicians and getting this really sort of first-class education from them from a very young age. So ends up becoming a professional conductor around the age of 19. And he wrote this horn concerto when he was 18. And we have our guest artist, Leonie Sterrett, who's going to come and talk about this. You welcome her. Hi, Leonie.
Hi, Lauren.
Great. Why don't we start with you? Can you give us your origin story?
Yes, so I grew up in Michigan. I started playing the horn because music was sort of in my family. Not in any professional sense, but I would say my parents and my immediate family was very musically enthusiastic. And I listened to a lot of public radio growing up. And my mom is an amateur flute player who was always just very active in community music, and my dad is a music lover, never really played anything except harmonica and as a virtuoso whistler. But it was just something that I grew up hearing a lot. I both loved classical music. So it was very natural. I have 2 younger siblings who are all sort of expected to at least make an attempt at learning an instrument. I tried to play piano from the ages of 5 to 7. It was a disaster. I was one of those kids who would melt down in front of the keyboard and just couldn't practice. So set that aside for a while, but I started playing the horn as a 5th grader in the school band program, and I wanted to play the saxophone. And my mom said, "Oh, sweetie, why don't you play the horn instead?" I was like, I don't know why. She just, I think being a woodwind player, she was reluctant to have a beginning reed player in the house, but not really understanding how bad it was going to be to have a beginning brass player in the house. Maybe, horn is a tricky instrument to start on, just because you sort of end up in a range that's not super easy to target on the horn for your initial notes as a band student. So, I can remember like the whole idea that you needed to come in on the right note initially. Horn players do this when you're little. You play all the notes you know you're going to play the scale to find your starting pitch in the first couple of years. So I did a lot of that.
Sorry, I'll
yeah, sure.
Brass instruments, you can play a bunch of different notes with the same finger.
Yes.
On horn, they're a lot closer together than they are on the other brass instruments, so it's easy to get caught on the wrong one.
It's a little bit treacherous starting out. The learning curve is kind of like this. Other instruments tend to sort of have maybe an easier entry, and then, when you get into more advanced techniques, you really sort of take off into really needing to have these chops to play. And horn is kind of like that entry barrier is is kind of high. Nonetheless, I really, really liked it. I mean, I wasn't one of those kids who was like obsessively practicing, but I just didn't ever quit it. I picked it up. I was lucky enough that my parents encouraged me to go to summer music camp. So I went to band camp. I played in the school ensembles for a bit. In Michigan, I was growing up very close to Interlochen Center for the Arts, which is kind of a big just arts campus in northern Michigan. And there's a summer music festival that has guest artists who come, but also a camp that's like 2,000 kids every summer. So I did that. There's a full year boarding school, academic high school that I ended up going to for my last years of high school. And I started studying with the horn teacher there when I was young because we were about an hour away. So I spent my Saturdays going from like cross country meet in the morning to horn lesson in the afternoon, and then youth orchestra rehearsals and kind of packing it all in. But I really liked the challenge of horn. It was something just kind of different in the sense that once I started listening to music and getting a little bit curious about what this instrument was, and it just kind of opened up this world of discovery and possibility. And I really had no idea what I was doing with it, in the sense like that I wasn't seized with this passion to like become a professional musician, because quite frankly I didn't really know how you became a person who played in an orchestra or anything like that. But I got really lucky to have a good teacher who sort of kind of kept me on the path of, well, if you like it, just keep doing it. You know, you're going to the summer camps, now maybe you want to think about applying for college, that sort of thing, which I ended up doing. I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, which is where I know Grant from. And I got a bachelor's of music there, and I kind of, around that time, and when I was kind of maybe my last years of high school and going into college, I got bit hard by the orchestral bug, and that kind of came into focus maybe as the thing that I really wanted to do. I love playing in an orchestra. I think it's kind of the emotions of that are just elevated on a sense that really nothing else, even the music field, sort of does for me. So I kind of geared my horn studies around that. I had a great teacher who was keeping me balanced and making me do the concerto competition and you know, kind of cover all my bases as far as repertoire. But I got really hungry to start taking auditions early on. So we were very lucky in Wisconsin. There's a pretty large network of regional orchestras that were kind of like a once a month, I think maybe similar when you compare like lacrosse out to maybe a little smaller than here, but I think, but there were opportunities to go out and play and learn and play within a network of really strong musicians within the state of Wisconsin. So I was doing that, taking auditions for those type of groups, playing. Started doing music summer festivals and traveling. I went to Japan one summer for the Pacific Music Festival. I went to Tanglewood and did that. And it just kind of reinforced the idea that this is what I really wanted to do. I went to grad school at Yale School of Music, was there for 2 years, continuing to take auditions, not having any real success at that point, which is kind of how it goes in this field. Came out of grad school. I spent 2 years in New York in a postgraduate fellowship program through Carnegie Hall, where we did a lot of actually education work and outreach work alongside performance. It was kind of geared toward this idea that as music performers, you have to have those educational skills, you have to have those communication abilities, that sort of thing, to actually take what you do, and you have to be able to share it with people in a meaningful way. So spent 2 years sort of workshopping that sort of thing. And along the way, I started doing a little bit better at auditions. I actually ended up in a position to be a substitute player with the New York Philharmonic while I was in New York. I auditioned 4 times before I was successful for the Philharmonic specifically. But shortly after, about a year after I was coming out of this program at Carnegie Hall, I spent a year as a full-time substitute with the orchestra. At the end of that, I won a job for a full-time position with the orchestra. So I've been there ever since. I'm currently the acting associate principal horn. The Philharmonic, I'm the 3rd horn there in sort of my usual job capacity. And it's been, it's a dream come true, because I knew music was for me. I discovered that orchestral playing was the path that I wanted to take, and just feel really, really lucky that it worked out this way, and I get to play with an orchestra. It's unbelievable. So yeah.
So a little bit of jargon there. What does it mean to be an acting associate?
Yes, so the horn section of our orchestra, we have 6 positions. And you normally have your principal, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and then in the Philharmonic we have the associate principal, who's kind of like the B team leader. So principal is normally going to be doing the major symphonic work, things like that. The way our orchestra is structured, the associate, I'm often playing the overtures, the concertos, the first half repertoire, and so it's you split up the work between the principal and the associate. Just because it's such a heavy load of playing. Our normal concert load is between 3 and 5 concerts a week, and every week is a new program. So if you've got, Mahler 5 one week, and then the next week is like all this Mozart delicate playing, something like that, and the week after you've got Strauss something or other, it's just too much for one person to do. In fact, it's so much work for one person to do that we have the principal and the associate who split the program, and then we also have an assistant principal, utility horn, who sits to the left of the principal and is sort of helping out with some of the heavy duties, giving whoever's sitting in the principal chair a little bit of a break and supporting the rest of the section too. So to cover 4 horn parts, you essentially have 5 people. So that makes up our 6-person section. So since 2017, I've been doing the associate principal job. So
Yeah, it's sort of like tag team. You can actually see it back there. Sort of play this, play this, play this.
Yeah.
kind of thing sometimes.
Assistant to the principal, being the better. For the opposite, that would be a more accurate. Yeah. So,
Well, talk about the Strauss.
Yeah.
Every horn player in the grandma plays this.
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
how did you get to know it? And
I was thinking I probably started working on this piece for the first time when I was maybe 16 or 17, coming out of high school, knowing I was going to audition to be a music major, and sort of dipping my toes into some of like the scholarship programs and competition programs available for high schoolers. And this piece is like the piece. We have our 4 wonderful Mozart concertos too, and either one of those 4 or Strauss one, and those are like take your pick, and that is your kind of calling card when it comes to auditioning for colleges, auditioning for orchestras, auditioning for summer programs, anything like this. So I've lived with it for a long time, and I teach now as well, so I would say every 2 weeks I'm listening to a student play this piece. So it is familiar, and Strauss is my favorite composer. I had to pick one, and I picked Strauss. So, this piece just becomes more fun the more you live with it too. Like it gets into your blood. It just becomes almost. If there's one piece that I maybe know better than any other in solo repertoire, it's this one. It's just so natural. You mentioned that Strauss's father was Franz Strauss, who was a horn player, and you can hear that in the way he's written for the horn. To me, Strauss still really is the orchestral standard too, in terms of how he uses the horns, the kind of writing that he does for that. It really doesn't get any better than playing a Strauss horn for an orchestral player. And so this piece is definitely maybe a light version of that. Not in terms of the amount of playing that you're trying to do, but in the tonal language. It's pretty straightforward and romantic, but it's got just some amazing moments. Like the second movement, the duet that happens between the solo horn and the woodwinds. It's so it's almost like chamber music in a sense, but the most lush version of that you can imagine. So and I always do like to remind my students that he wrote this when he was 18. They're always surprised by that too, because I think, like as music students, we feel like we're sort of like waiting to be given permission, or waiting to be given like, okay, here's your card, now you're a musician or something like that. But I think it's good to remind them that here's Strauss at age 18 writing this piece. Now we don't need to be as prodigious as he was, but you can inhabit this piece as a young person and as somebody who's still learning in the same way that a seasoned professional can too. So.
Yeah, that's sort of an interesting connection. A lot of young players play this piece, which is written by a young composer.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose you can make that connection.
Yeah, hopefully it's kind of aspirational to think about that your experience, maybe the first time you encounter this piece, you're the same age as Strauss was when he was writing it. Like, that's pretty cool to think about how your experience in the world is the same or different, or what it tells you. But I always think it's interesting too, you have this piece, the first concerto when he was 18, and then you have the second horn concerto, which he came back to at the end of his life. I'm going to botch the year of this, but the late 40s, basically, when he wrote another horn concerto. At this point, as you said, he was 85 when he died. He lived through basically like the before times, so before the World Wars, and into the after, and seeing the world just change like that. And he came back at the end of his life after he had written like Salome and Electra and these crazy operas that harmonically just started to like pull apart. And he came back and he wrote a horn concerto, which is really, really old-fashioned, and in the same key as the original, and a total look back. It's very interesting. His life is sort of bookmarked by these horn concertos. Well, it's not that interesting.
Yeah, and Strauss is an interesting person in that, as you say, like, as he gets older, like, he's really innovative and sort of going nuts and doing things that nobody else has done with the orchestra before. But at the end of the day, he's also one of the most old-fashioned composers, even as innovative and as wild as some of the ideas he has are. He's sort of a romantic all the way to the end, in a way that a lot of the composers that he was around in the 30s and 20s and 40s weren't. So, he does have that kind of conservative streak, even again as he's sort of changing the world in a way. Well, should we listen to a bit? So this is a three-movement piece, but all the movements are connected to each other. I'll try and see if I can find appropriate spots, but let's just hear some of the opening. Good, we did a little sort of orchestral interlude there. And any thoughts you want to share, Leah?
I really like this player. Katie is now the principal member of the Concertgebouw Orchestra in Amsterdam, so I think she's a really great example of sort of contemporary horn playing, and sort of the newest generation of kind of players who are up and coming. So I just like the energy in this performance. Like, you can hear that she knows the music and she's looking at the notes on the page, but there's another level to this for me of kind of not being like tied to exactly like what's there. So taking that information that's on the page, but actually like making an interpretation of it, which I enjoy a lot. I think because this is it's a student piece, you know, I mean, it's not, well, it's a student piece because we all learn it as students and we all play it a lot as students. It can be very, you get into this mindset of, am I doing it right or am I doing it wrong? You know, that's kind of what happens with a piece that's kind of as standard and beloved as this. So I like that she kind of does something different. There's these kind of zippy notes that come out, and it's not exactly how I play it, but you can hear kind of somebody just playing with those notes on the page, you know, and what it means, and kind of it like giving you everything that's there as far as what Strauss wanted, but then so here it looks like that.
Yeah, if I may be unkind for a moment, this is a piece that I've heard played badly so many times. It's nice to hear it sound good. I'm going to kick it over to the second movement a little bit. Here's our little transition. The second movement is in everybody's favorite key, which is A flat minor. Basically all the flats you can get. cyclic things where tunes were coming back in different movements, which is rare for his day. That's much more of a romantic thing. And I don't know if you caught that, but that's what we get at this moment, where this ba-ya-dee-da is exactly the same as the opening tune in the first movement. But did you have something you want to share about that section?
Oh, I love, that's my favorite section, the whole piece. Is this little middle breakdown here. I mean, yeah, it's funny, it goes from A flat, and for the horn, it's E flat, and you go into the D major. It's like, whoa, yeah, but it's this incredible moment, and just that texture, that underneath, it's unique. I mean, you hear music like this maybe after Strauss, but this sort of playfulness in a sense, or just there's something so alive in that music, and this horn line over top, I mean, he does all the right things that a composer should do. Oh yeah, this big gap, fall back down, and then you fill in the gaps. They kind of end in the middle. It's so satisfying to play something like that. Yeah, it's in a great range too.
Well, you mentioned keys, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Strauss called this a Waldhorn-Konzert, so that means forest horn, a natural horn, a valveless horn. Can you play this on valveless horn?
You can, but not really.
Okay.
I mean, it's like this section in particular. If he writes it for horn and half, but really you would probably need to play it on the E flat natural horn. I've never tried. I've always thought that it would be very helpful if he had written this concerto in E flat and the second horn concerto, which is in E flat in F, for the horn part. Horn players know what I'm talking about, but you could, but it's actually thought that it was a little bit of a joke between father and son. So Franz Strauss, the father, would have been, he knew how to play both the natural horn without valves and the valve horn, which was a pretty new instrument at the time that this was being written. But it would be really hard, actually. There was just a horn player, actually. I don't know if anybody saw this guy from, also a concerto horn player. He got his natural horn over the holidays of kind of a COVID quarantine holiday in the Netherlands, and was playing through some of this, the opening on the natural horn. And there's a lot of those notes where you have to cover with your hand in order to get the right tonality. So a natural horn piece is mostly kind of characterized by the fact that there are more open notes, I would say, than stop, and the stop notes are a part of the phrasing. So they give it a little extra, that E that we heard in the Mozart, and they give it a little extra snarl, a little extra bleat, or confusion to the sound. So you would not necessarily consider that this was idiomatic on the natural horn. Technically, anything is playable on the natural horn. If you're good enough with your hand, you can get all the chromatic pitches by kind of adjusting how much of your hand is covering that bell. But you would listen to it and be like, I'd maybe rather hear it on the modern horn, if I'm being honest. So.
Well, I think we'll save the big Hollywood ending for Saturday nights. Do you have questions for the
I noticed in that first video that there were two different styles of natural horn.
Yeah.
Are there lots of different ones, or are they set?
Yes. So those two, they might have been different makers, or they might have been the same. But the upper horns are in G, and I think the third and fourth are in D. Is that right? Or
B flat?
B flat. Okay, B flat and G. So you'd have smaller horns playing the G because it's just a higher key, and the B flat horns were a little bit different. So probably in those horns, it
B
looks
flat
like,
alto, unfortunately.
oh, that's right. Yeah. So
B flat horns can be in two different octaves.
yeah, because the low one, which is that's the good one, or the high one, you go no. So if you do that, the orchestra, it's like horn and B flat. Which B flat? Okay, because either you're working in the high range or you're kind of sitting comfortably. So that looked like those were horns where you would, kind of the corpus was the same, but you take out, if you notice the upper horns had a little tiny loop by the lead pipe, that makes it G, and the other ones had kind of more hardware they were working with, so the B flat horns. I think I read that, although if they were B flat alto, they should be small, or they're actually smaller, maybe they didn't have that. They must have been, yes. I know.
Didn't catch
it. But there are also different styles of there was sort of a natural horn that was more or a orchestral horn, and then there was a natural horn that was more a solo horn. And something like the Mozart horn concertos are written for the chorus solo in E flat, that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, the whole idea of natural horn, that's our roots as an instrument actually coming from hunting horns, that sort of thing, going even further back, like the shofar, just basic animal horns. So it went through quite a big evolution, but kind of, if you're talking about the symphonic repertoire as we know it, it's sort of, everything came together around just a couple different styles of horns. In Bach's day, there would have been a different type of Baroque horn, maybe even smaller bore, I don't really know. But you notice too how like that principal horn, you can almost see his whole hand in the bell, and in our modern horns, your hand kind of gets swallowed up inside an instrument, but these natural horns were sort of smaller on the whole and more delicate, and kind of came from that tradition. So, you're welcome.
Yeah, in Bach's day, you have no idea what instrument you're supposed to play for virtually anything. It's like, what does this word even mean? So,
Give it to the trumpet.
Yeah, yeah,
Right? Too high, yeah.
Keys for different horns.
Yeah. Other stuff? Well, thanks everyone. Thank you, Renee. And we'll see you on Saturday.